For decades, people around the world believed they understood why Ringo Starr and the rest of the Beatles finally broke apart. Most fans blamed money problems, business disagreements, or arguments over management. That story stayed alive for years because it sounded simple and believable. But as Ringo grew older, he began speaking more openly about what really happened inside the band. According to him, the truth was much more personal and painful. The four men who once felt like brothers slowly stopped understanding each other. Small arguments became bigger over time. Long recording sessions created frustration. Fame placed pressure on every relationship in their lives. By the late 1960s, they were no longer four young musicians chasing one dream together. They were exhausted men carrying different ambitions, fears, and emotions. Ringo explained that people often imagine the breakup as one giant explosion, but it was actually a slow process that happened over several years. Even while they were still making legendary music, the friendships inside the group were weakening. What makes Ringo's words powerful is that he does not speak with anger anymore. Instead, he talks like someone who has spent years trying to understand what happened to people he once loved deeply. His honesty gives fans a much more human picture of the Beatles. Behind the fame, the screaming crowds, and the record-breaking success were four very different personalities trying to survive impossible pressure. Ringo's story is not only about music. It is also about friendship, loyalty, loneliness, success, and the emotional cost of becoming the most famous band in history. By finally speaking openly at the age of 85, he helped many fans realize that the Beatles did not end because of one single event. They ended because human relationships are complicated, especially when the whole world is watching every move you make. That honesty has made people look at the Beatles' story in a completely different way, not as a fairy tale destroyed by business, but as the story of four men who slowly drifted apart while trying to carry the weight of worldwide fame. Long before he became famous, Ringo Starr lived a life filled with struggle and uncertainty. Born Richard Starkey in Liverpool in 1940, he grew up in a poor neighborhood during difficult years in England. His father left the family when he was still a small child, leaving his mother Elsie to raise him alone. Money was always tight, and life in Liverpool after the war was hard for many families. But the biggest challenges in Ringo's childhood came from illness. When he was only 6 years old, his appendix burst and caused a dangerous infection that nearly killed him. He spent a long time in the hospital recovering while other children continued normal life outside. Later, as a teenager, he became sick again with tuberculosis and was sent to a sanatorium for many months. Altogether, he lost several years of school because of illness. During those lonely years in hospitals, Ringo often felt separated from the world around him. Yet those difficult experiences quietly shaped the person he would later become. While recovering in the hospital, he discovered music through a small drum that was handed to him during a music activity. Something about rhythm connected with him immediately. For the first time, he found something that made him excited about the future. He practiced constantly, even using simple objects around his bed like drums. Music gave him confidence at a time when illness had taken away so much of his childhood. These experiences also affected his personality. Unlike some rock stars who grew up full of confidence, Ringo often carried insecurity and self-doubt deep inside himself. Years later, even after becoming one of the most famous musicians on earth, he still sometimes felt like the lonely boy who had spent years in hospital rooms watching life pass him by. Many people believe this background is one reason he later tried to keep peace inside the Beatles whenever arguments happened. He understood pain and loneliness better than most people realized. His difficult childhood also taught him to value friendship deeply, which made the emotional collapse of the Beatles especially painful for him later in life. Before joining the Beatles, Ringo was already respected in Liverpool's music scene because of his work with Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. At that time, the group was actually more popular locally than the Beatles themselves. Ringo had built a reputation as a talented and dependable drummer who could handle long performances and difficult crowds. During the early 1960s, many Liverpool bands traveled to Hamburg, Germany, where musicians played exhausting nightclub shows late into the night. Both the Hurricanes and the Beatles spent important years there, surviving rough conditions together while learning how to entertain audiences. Those nights created strong bonds between the musicians because they shared the same struggles and ambitions. Ringo got to know John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison during this period, long before he officially joined the Beatles. When producer George Martin and manager Brian Epstein decided drummer Pete Best was not the right fit for the future of the band, the other Beatles already knew exactly who they wanted to replace him. They trusted Ringo both personally and musically. In 1962, he officially became part of the Beatles, but his arrival was not welcomed by everyone. Many fans loved Pete Best and were angry about the change. Some crowds shouted against Ringo during performances, and tensions were high during his first appearances with the band. Even so, the chemistry between the four Beatles quickly became clear. Ringo's humor, calm personality, and unique drumming style fit naturally with the group. Soon after he joined, Beatlemania exploded around the world. Suddenly, the Beatles were no longer just musicians from Liverpool. They became international stars followed everywhere by screaming fans and non-stop media attention. For Ringo, the experience was exciting but also overwhelming. He had joined the biggest musical movement in the world almost overnight, and part of him still wondered if he truly belonged beside the other three. That quiet insecurity stayed with him even during the group's greatest moments of success and fame. As the Beatles became more successful, cracks slowly started forming inside the group. At first, those problems were hidden behind the excitement of touring, recording, and worldwide fame. The Beatles were constantly traveling, performing, giving interviews, and making films. Their schedule left almost no room for normal life. During the height of Beatlemania, they barely had time to think clearly because everything moved so fast. Yet underneath the success, different personalities and creative goals were beginning to clash. John Lennon and Paul McCartney remained the main songwriting partnership, while George Harrison increasingly felt frustrated that his own songs were often pushed aside. Ringo also sometimes felt left out creatively, even though he was essential to the band's sound. He only received a few songwriting opportunities during the Beatles' years, despite contributing greatly to the group's personality and musical identity. Over time, each member began wanting different things from life and music. Touring eventually became exhausting and dangerous because crowds were so loud that the band could barely hear themselves play. In 1966, the Beatles stopped touring completely after their final concert at Candlestick Park in San Francisco. At first, this decision seemed positive because it gave them more freedom in the studio. Albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band showed incredible musical creativity and changed popular music forever. But spending endless hours in recording studios also created new tension. Songs were now carefully built piece by piece instead of being performed naturally together as a live band. The atmosphere slowly changed from teamwork into something more divided. The Beatles still created brilliant music, but emotionally they were drifting apart. Each person was becoming more focused on individual ideas instead of group unity. Ringo later explained that this was one of the saddest parts of the Beatles' story. Even while creating songs that millions of people loved, the friendships inside the band were weakening. Fame had given them everything they dreamed of materially, yet emotionally it was pushing them further away from one another. The pressure of always being the Beatles became harder and harder to carry, especially because the entire world expected perfection from them every single day. The tensions inside the Beatles became impossible to ignore during the recording of the Beatles, commonly called the White Album. By this point, the atmosphere inside the studio had changed completely from the joyful early years of the band. The Beatles had recently returned from India, where they studied meditation with Maharishi Mahesh Yogi. The trip was supposed to bring peace and spiritual growth, but instead it left many emotional questions unresolved. Back in London, recording sessions became stressful and uncomfortable. Often, the Beatles worked separately instead of together. Some songs featured only certain members while others stayed away entirely. The sense of unity that once defined the group was fading quickly. During these difficult sessions, Ringo reached a breaking point. Feeling unwanted and emotionally disconnected, he walked out of the band temporarily in August 1968. he later admitted that he believed the others were happier without him. What makes this moment especially sad is that each Beatle privately felt isolated in different ways. Even though they were standing in the same room, all four men felt emotionally alone. After leaving the studio, Ringo traveled to Sardinia with his family, hoping to escape the stress surrounding the band. While there, he heard a story about octopuses collecting objects to create peaceful spaces under the sea. That idea later inspired his song Octopus's Garden, which reflected his desire for comfort and emotional safety during a chaotic period of his life. Eventually, the other Beatles asked him to return. When he came back to the studio, he found his drum set covered in flowers as a welcome gesture from the others. It showed that love and affection still existed between them despite the growing conflict. However, the deeper problems remained unresolved. The White Album sessions became a symbol of a band slowly losing its connection. Even though the music itself became legendary, the recording process revealed how emotionally exhausted the Beatles truly were. Ringo later described this period not as one dramatic fight but as a painful slow separation that nobody fully knew how to stop. The friendships were still there, but they no longer functioned the same way they once had during the band's early years. The final years of the Beatles were filled with arguments, emotional distance, and business confusion that pushed the group closer to collapse. After Brian Epstein died in 1967, the band lost the one person who had successfully managed their careers and kept everyone united. Without his leadership, important decisions became sources of conflict. Financial problems at Apple Corp created stress, and disagreements over management divided the group even further. John Lennon, George Harrison, and Ringo supported businessman Alan Klein, while Paul McCartney wanted his future father-in-law Lee Eastman to handle their affairs. This disagreement created deep mistrust between the members.